it's Monday. No, I'm not going to do that because I don't know how you feel about Mondays, but there's a lot of joking about office lore and being overly excited on a Monday. But hey, look, we're here, we're alive, we're together. Are you ready to talk about AP government? I know that you are. Okay, I hear you. Let's get started. I got to figure out where my PowerPoint is. Oh, what did I do with it already? Let's see what we have going on here. Oh gosh, here you go. You got to watch me fumble. Hi, welcome to my classroom. I'm learning how to do technology. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, hopefully you guys can see this. You know who I am. It's me, Miss Hitch. Hope you had a great weekend. I hope you're finding some respite from the craziness. Of course you are. You're here, right? Today, we're going to talk about 2.13. We're going to talk about bureaucracy. We're going to do all kinds of fun stuff. This is material for teachers, and we're going to continue walking down the road of our content application FRQ. But first, great questions. So Faith has been really busy with Dan over the Twitter time, twittering back and forth, grading other people's stuff. You guys are doing amazing. So thank you so much. You guys are my policy wonks for sure. She asked a really great question, and I had to go and do further research. And these are the questions that I love. I love it when you ask me questions and I don't know the answer, because especially as we get into civil rights and liberties, you're going to find that there are so many corners of the content that really are unexpected, that are interesting, that span the gamut in terms of all kinds of fields of study. And that's another reason, a sidebar, that's another reason why I love this course, is because you're really taking there's at least 4 major disciplines that find rooting here, right? You can be a constitutional scholar, you can be a lawyer, you can go to public policy, you can be in political science. We can go further than that too. You can be a data scientist, you can be a political psychologist, all different kinds of things. But Faith wants to know about jury trials. And she must know that Wednesday we start the last unit on the courts. So the question, if you waive your right to a jury trial, does a judge have a right to grant it? So my first initial thought was, oh, no, they're your rights. But I also know that this, the way that jurisprudence works and that case law works, is that I'm always flabbergasted at where the limitations are in the system, and they've developed over time. And so I did some research, and here's what I came up with. Yes, the judge can deny your petition for a jury trial. So one of the bigger ones that I found that kind of was the first Google search that I pulled up, thank you, Google, was with the 2018 case of the Missouri Governor Eric Greitens, or Greitens, you can correct my pronunciation, all you Missourians, who was in trouble with the law for various things. And he had petitioned. A petition is a formal request. You have to ask the judge. And so it was denied. They said flat out, no, you have to have a jury trial. And the concern there is that a jury trial is a form of representation. It's kind of like the other side of the coin of representation through elected officials and voting. So the jury is a really critically important component, where it's supposed to be like a cross section of just your average typical kind of your peers, right? A jury of your peers. And so when you ask for a bench trial, you are curtailing the ability for the state to, well, I should say, it might give you an advantage. And so a judge can go back and review to see if there's an advantage that might come from having a bench trial, like say if you appointed a judge or something along those lines, would be taken into consideration. So yeah, surprisingly enough, there can be cases in which a jury trial is forced on a defendant. I'm sure there's more than beyond that. And so I would say, if this is something where you're like, wow, that's really weird, and I never would have thought that, that's how much fun the law is. The law is, it's got twists and turns and it's unexpected all the time. All right, Dev is back with another question for us, asking about logistics on the exam. So I do want to dispel some myths that I don't think exist, but I'll just pretend like they do. I have no idea what the questions are. I haven't seen them. They would never show them to me. Let's say even if they wanted to, which isn't happening, I would say no, because guys, I can't keep a secret. So I would end up saying something. So all I can tell you is what's been said by College Board, that the argumentation FRQ is 60% of the score, that the concept application is 40%, and where those scores added up would break between the total score of a 1 and a 5 remains to be seen. I have no idea. That process is done separately after the scoring is completed. And I couldn't begin to tell you where that would be. That's a story for a different day, probably in July, that College Board will tackle. What I can tell you is that a 5 out of a 5 and a 3 out of a 3 is a 5. I mean, I'm going to take a wild guess there. Hope that was helpful. I'm sure it wasn't. All right, here's our warm up for today. So you guys took a look at this one on the loss, technological changes and the impact of automation on the workforce. And over the weekend, you guys, I gave feedback on Saturday, and then I called in special friend, my mentor. She's everything I want to be when I get older. Her name is Miss Rebecca Small. She is a co-worker. She's kind of, I guess she's kind of my boss. I don't know. It's weird. Bureaucracy. We'll talk more about it later. But she was guest grading. So if you see anything from her, she is amazing. And if she gives you any feedback, then it's great, right? You're good to go. So she gave a bunch of kids feedback over the weekend. If you see other people who look like adults who are asking to give feedback, it's just people trying to help out because man, everybody, I want to help everybody, but I'm having a hard time doing it. Okay, so here we go. Let's break this down. I pulled this down from the Twitter, and here is our prompt. We have A, describe a governmental policy response to technological changes depicted in the excerpt. Now down towards the bottom, you see what College Board is looking for, right? So here's our scoring line. We're looking for the response to describe a governmental policy response to technological changes, and it gives us some samples. This is a guideline, right? Like this is, you have to keep in mind that there's, this is kind of the gist of where we're going. And so when I looked at this particular response where Congress could draft legislation and the appropriate funds for a national jobs training program, which would recruit workers who are structurally unemployed due to technological advances and train them to engage in new industries that are hiring, what we need to see is that there's some kind of concrete policy solution, right? So you're proposing some kind of concrete policy solution. And I got like 4 or 5 different variations. Some people said like quotas on how much work is automated versus how much is human. I saw job training. I saw unemployment assistance. I didn't really see tax breaks too much, but you're kind of along those lines. And as long as it was concrete, as long as I could close my eyes and picture an action taken by the federal government, it worked. There were a couple responses where students kind of were vague, and they were like, well, they can like help them out by just trying to improve, improve job retention. And that's not clear enough. Like improve how and who would be doing what. So you have to remember, kind of tell me the actor, what's the action, be concrete. Those are the components that we're looking for here. So I see a lovely description in yellow. Very nice job. The one thing that I would say is, remember, because we're overworking here, because you have 40% of this prompt is wrapped up in 3 points, my recommendation is to explain as well. I spent a lot of time last class talking about the difference between those task verbs. This is an example for us to be able to look and see where that description is, right? Like we're illuminating what this jobs training would be, provision of strengthening employment, but that doesn't tell me anything about interaction or how it would, like why it helps with technological changes. So not that you necessarily need it for this one, for A, but it helps get that point, okay? B, explain how an ideological perspective corresponds to the policy response described in A. Now, remember, the one thing that I recommended last week was that you can never go wrong by doubling up ideology and party ID. Ideology and party ID. you may not know, like sometimes I've just seen kids where they're going so fast in the response and the response double steps through a keyword and they don't get the right thing. And there were a couple people over the weekend who didn't read ideological and instead they talked about party for B. And it's not about party, it's about ideology. So if you're confused or you're like feeling self-doubt, just double step it, right? Liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans, generally speaking, because we live in times of extreme polarization, you're going to be pretty good. All right, so here, the response here talks about consistent involvement in federal jobs training program, because as soon as we see because, let's look. Oh, here we go. We have our description down below. I want to start with the description because you should, even though B's say explain, remember College Board wants us to describe and explain. So our description of liberal ideology and how your solution from A match up is down below. Fiscal liberal would advocate government action to curtail the associated structural employment. Beautiful, right? So now we need to come back around for the explain. And we have it, right? We have that turn signal. We're indicating that we're changing lanes into our explanation because it hires people on the belief that the government involvement in the economy is a net positive, or hinges, sorry, I had something in the way. That is a great description. Very, very nice. All right. So then we come back to C, which is explain how core American values could be affected by technological innovations in the economy. Again, they're giving you some examples down there. It might include the following. You're not limited to them, but you really want to make sure that you're showing how American core values could be affected by those innovations. I like the repetition of the prompt. So here we come up against it again. I would say that this is a hashtag minor factual error, right? I was looking for individualism. And one of the ones that I will say before I move any further is that the one consistent thing I saw kids going astray on C was that you didn't know the core American values, which is individualism, free market values, equality of opportunity, limited government, and rule of law. So you had to talk about one of those 5 things. And so saw some going astray on that component. And it's, you know, in this case, since it's open, and I know that that comes from unit 4, remember we're covering stuff that runs the whole course because that's what we're supposed to do for lots of reasons that I addressed in the very beginning of this. Although your question is supposed to be from units 1 through 3. But anyways, anywho, I saw individual, but when I read on, I saw more of an indication and description of individualism, which to me, I was like, it's not quite how I want it to be. But as I read on, I can see that they understood that it's individualism. And that's a really important point to hit home, is that I know, especially teaching, I mean, I've been around here for a long time. And I know that kids like to just get the minimum amount on the paper as possible. You have to avoid that urge. In this case, the student response clinches this idea of individualism by elaborating, by going on to describe it. And that is a really important point to drive home, is that if you're just doing the bare minimum, you are decreasing the likelihood that you either get the right terminology or that you may need support by elaboration later on. If the point's on the page, we will find it, but elaborating it increases the odds that you've really got that point. So continue on, right? Really extend that thought, get that description down on paper. This response described what individualism was, and despite the fact that they didn't say individual, I can say, well, that's a minor factual error because I see understanding through the rest of the response. And here is their explanation, right? Very nice job. They did a very good job in terms of individualism, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a 3 out of 3. So here's our one more of these, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. Congress made a set of laws, a law set a standard of factories to follow. I see them continuing on when they say in which a certain percentage. There, they're giving us our description. Beautiful job. And then there's a little bit of an explanation because they're saying factories would have to hire, but they can still use robots and computers. So good for A. B, Democrats who have a more liberal ideology, do you see the double step where they're like Democrats and liberal, would support the policy to set strict standards. So we're repeating our prompt. Beautiful. Why? They're telling us what is the definition, all right, what do liberals prefer? Strong government regulation in the economy. They're contrasting it in the next statement with Republicans and what they prefer. And so we come to the end where they step out and say, they would prefer to allow factories to hire robots, computer programs, so on and so forth, instead of being forced to comply. So this gives us a full explanation in terms of why this policy of allowing, these standards, why this would be clearer. The one thing I will say is that it's a little wishy-washy in terms of staking a claim and coming up with a clean answer. So I see them comparing, but the B point, despite the fact that they did a beautiful job, they failed to tell me exactly, because you kind of have a policy here that spans the gap. You got to pick one, right? Is it liberal or is it conservative? And so the B point misses here because there's no clear statement being said that this policy that I said in A is this, despite the fact that they said, this is what liberals do, this is what conservatives do. All right, C, Americans tend to value equality of opportunity. Underline it, that's an identify. They go on to tell me what it is, that's a description. And then they go on to give me an explanation. Beautiful, that's a 2 out of 3. Okay, perfect. Bureaucracy, let's get on it. You guys know the bureaucracy. You're interacting with it all the time because you guys are all students in schools, and schools are a form of bureaucracy. Now that's state and local. So let's think about that structure and what we recognize to think about how the bureaucracy works at the federal level, which, unless you live in Washington, D.C., it might be difficult for you to see it. Although I will tell you that there are just a ton of federal employees throughout the entirety of the United States. They're in every single state. They're in most major cities. So you may know people who work for the federal bureaucracy. Okay, so we start here. I love starting in the Constitution. What gives us the power to do these things? Obviously, we're starting there with Article 1, Section 8. Congress has the ability to create the bureaucracy. So this is kind of our first thing. We have to remember that anytime we're changing the bureaucracy, anytime that we're creating a new bureaucracy, we're streamlining them together, whatever it might be, that's going to be an act of Congress, and they are going to support them through appropriations. The flip side of that is that there's a couple of clauses in Article 2 that make it feel like maybe it's not just the Congress who's in charge. The first one is the president is allowed to require the opinion in writing of the principal officers in each of the executive departments. So we're thinking here, okay, they are taking advice. Now there's some really important stuff here that I want to step out of for 1 second, and that is may require. So we see here that there will be principal officers, and they're at the inception of our country, it was Treasury, it was state, it was the Department of War, and the Postal Office. It wasn't very big. Taxes weren't a huge thing for the national government. Like, we were kind of just bare bones, right? So the whole thing of like may require the opinion isn't important. May is super important. I want to underline that, because if they were required to take the advice, if there was something that happened that was active, right, an active component of that relationship, meaning an additional check, then you would not have a singular executive. And we know that there was much conversation about the concept of a plural executive, concerns that it would curtail the ability of the government, of the federal government, to respond to emergency situations, so on and so forth. So what we see here is that the president can get the advice from appointed personnel. They can appoint individuals who they will task to go ahead and execute law, but in no way are they subservient or are they peers in power with those individuals. He or she is responsible alone for the outcome of whatever those policy decisions are, that he relies on those individuals. And it's kind of fun to think about George Washington. He remarked, he was not a highly formally educated individual. He was very self-conscious about the fact that he didn't have the kind of or the educational gravitas that some of the other founding fathers had. But what he was really good at was finding people to appoint to positions to counsel him, and he listened to them. So the cabinet, that informal structure, is something that he gifted American tradition, American government, that was critically important. Now, that power to nominate is separate from the power to appoint. Again, the president is the appoints theirs alone. The only thing that a Senate can do is reject an appointment, and then the president will generally move on to another candidate. So this is critically important for us to kind of see that most of the power, even though there are checks, are going to be, there's a little bit of a structure in the Constitution, but over time, Congress will really kind of reinvigorate this decision to kind of put most of the bureaucracy in the hands of the president. Now, that being said, there are some bureaucratic agencies that are most responsible to the other branches. So there's 11 bureaucratic agencies in Congress, and there are 3 bureaucratic agencies supporting the Supreme Court. And then here's a really fun fact. We don't know exactly how many federal bureaucratic agencies there are. It depends on who you ask, and it depends on how you measure them. Kind of crazy. Okay, I know. So we've heard of the Library of Congress, the Congressional Budget Office, the United States Botanical Garden, the Farm Service is going to be under the president, Civil Rights Commission. My personal favorite government bureaucracy, the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation. What's up, all of my fellow fellows? And you see over here on the Supreme Court, you know, there's the police, there's the clerk department. All of these agencies are there to help facilitate the actions and activities that have been left to each individual branch. All of this is to say that this is a vital and increasingly relied upon component of the policy making cycle. Congress will delegate rulemaking and implementation to the bureaucracy to do these things in their stead, because Congress has a very, very different agenda. We've talked about how they legislate, how they do constituent services, and how they have oversight. And those are very laborious activities that require a lot of discussion, a lot of delegation, a lot of investigation, so on and so forth. But in terms of like the day-to-day enforcement and even crafting of some of the specific rules and regulations that the federal government have, they've turned that over to what is today a cast of over 2.5 million subject matter experts. So there's 2 sticky terms that I want to make sure that I clarify for you, because sometimes they show up, and it's, to be honest, there's a couple terms that I always get stuck on them, because it's just, I'm always like, and this is one of them. So line agencies and staff agencies. Line agencies, which you should know, line agencies like that, like the L, right? Like a big vertical line on the backside of that L. They have a vertical structure in which authority is concentrated at the top, and then it is delegated down through specialized tasks. So you have somebody who's in charge of the entire enforcement of whatever something might be, and they will pass off chunks of that authority down the line to people beneath them to execute those different various tasks. So this is an example of a line and staff and org chart from the final days of Barack Obama's presidency. And you see that even within the White House office, which we've talked a little bit about, again, this is the one where he has the most control over them, because they are his, I mean, for the most part, we actually categorize them as staff agencies because of what they do in the overall scheme of things. But even within that staff agency, they have these kind of predictable line authorities that are established. Staff agencies, they kind of like sidebar. What they're going to do is they're going to specialize at tasks, and they're going to advise the line agency as well as the executive from within their experience. So what you'll see is they kind of don't necessarily have as many people who are delegated to them to do like routine, constant behaviors. They might be there to help the president with larger kind of maybe policy issues, maybe managerial issues, whatever it might be. And so that's the difference between a line and a staff agency. That's kind of like baseline. You need to know that mostly associate line agencies with independent executive agencies, with departments, so on and so forth. And the White House office and executive office of the president, kind of at a snapshot in general, including all of them, we generalize it and say that they are our staff agencies. There are some exceptions to that. Just kind of, do your best. All right. So this idea of making a rule, because we're talking about the discretionary authority of the bureaucracy today. And so what we need to do is we need to go back to Article 1, Section 7, and we need to figure out, well, where do these ideas come from? And they start with us. They start with the people. It can be the people, you and I, we can write a law. Special interest groups can write a law, and they do all the time, all the time. It can be the president. The president is actually the number one person when it comes to setting proactive agenda or policy. They do that through the State of the Union address. They do that through their presidential platforms. And then Congress, obviously members of Congress can introduce bills. They are the only ones who can introduce bills. And so the component that has to go through Congress, the only folks who are talking are those who are actual members of Congress voted in. So all of these things kind of flow through Congress, right? We're going to see oftentimes if it's a presidential policy, the president will kind of find someone to shepherd that bill through Congress. They will, and that person will become a sponsor. They will be the major speaker in public discussions. They'll be the major speaker on the floor. That purpose of that individual is not only so that they can personally guide that bill through, but also it's a great way for the party to build a bench, right? We're taking somebody from out of the masses and we're elevating them, especially if it's a really, really cool policy or one of the president's headliners. We're kind of creating somebody who maybe wasn't known before that maybe will take more responsibility on in later years. So it has to go through both houses in identical form, and we know that it has to be presented to the president. So then after that's happened, the president gives executive orders, or in this case, presidential signing statements. It's going to be sent to the bureaucracy. And what Congress does is they delegate specific authority to the bureaucracy, very specific. They'll say in this specific issue, if we're looking at regulating water policy, right? We're thinking about like sewage issues. They're going to pick a very specific Office of Water and the EPA. This is your job. You are going to headline testing water quality nationwide to make sure that non-point specific runoff from farm fields or from roadsides isn't contaminating our water. And in that, because it is number one, in that specific thing when we're talking about regulating roadside runoff, right, gray water, it's really technical, super, super technical. You have to not be a member of Congress. You have to be a scientist. You have to be somebody who's in ecology or someone who's in chemistry or somebody, whatever, who's somewhere along those lines, who can understand how to craft policy with very specific targets, right? So we're like setting parts per million targets. It's acceptable to have so many parts per million in a water supply. That's not something Congress would do. That's something that they're going to leave the bureaucratic agencies to do. Number two, it's really hard to pass laws, particularly huge sweeping laws that are going to, drastically increase federal powers, that are going to centralize powers in a new agency, something along those lines. And so for that reason, they are going to want to create legislation that has enough kind of like you've been bumper bowling, right? Where you put the bumpers in, where we have boundaries on how far they can go, but where they actually send that ball down the lane is left to the experts to decide. And the final thing is we want policy to be responsive to new trends and innovations. So when technology advances, we don't have to go back to square one every single time. So Congress, the thing is they get to take credit for the legislation and they get to use oversight to prevent presidential and bureaucratic overreach. But they are leaving the daily execution, the really fine points, to the experts, the subject matter experts. The president will guide this process through the use of executive orders and other presidential directives to change enforcement of laws. If necessary, they'll use the presidential signing statements. And then our line agencies, those are our vertically articulated, often cabinet level positions. and independent executive agencies, they are going to have the capacity, the knowledge, the personnel, the institutions, the resources to be able to effectively implement those processes. So, let's think of some examples. Department of Homeland Security, what might they do? I want you to pause it for a second and kind of think about this to yourself. What kinds of rules might you see come out of the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Veteran Affairs, Department of Ed, Environmental Protection Agency, which we just talked about, the Federal Elections Commission, or the Security and Exchange Commission? Those are things that they're pretty high level. We, especially here, I was just speaking about directives that came down from the Department of Education. These are things where, they're in the news a lot. They have a lot of sway. So think about the things that you would expect them to have rules on. And I'm going to move forward. All right, so agencies, powerful because they have these delegated authorities. So the daily execution of federal laws are left to these bureaucrats who are subject matter experts, who have technical skills and resources, and they have several determinations of their power, determinants of their power. Number one, they have legal authority from Congress. They have presidential grants of power. They have the size and continuity of an agency's budget. And they have the deference of an agency employees who've gained through experience. So that ability for them to adapt policy where they think it would best fit, that discretion is kind of pulled together through all of these three components, right? They have some latitude and discretion to decide how to craft rules and regulations and how to enforce them. So let's step through this. So number one, an agency is going to interpret a law, and that is going to come up with more specific, often more qualitative rules and regulations. If you don't know the difference, rules are generally kind of like best practices or procedural components, whereas regulations tend to be a little bit more geared towards punitive response, kind of, I can't think of the word. If you break the law, if you break the regulation, you can go to court. So they're punitive in nature. The president, the executive office of the White House, the administrators, the subject matter experts, they are going to craft a rule, right? And it's mostly going to be in the hands of those line agencies. So for instance, the Energy Policy Conservation Act of 1975 requires that we have industry standards on fuel efficiency. If you go to buy a car, you see that white sticker in the window and it tells you this is the average mile per gallon that comes out of that. So the EPA tracks that because it has to do with energy consumption, it has to do with pollutants, so on and so forth. But it's not just them. They work in conjunction with the Department of Energy, and they work in conjunction with the National Highway Transportation Board. Each of them is going to kind of offer a separate issue that they'll bring to the table that is based on whatever the expertise of those agencies are. I've given you the examples of the National Highway Transportation Board will set our CAFE or corporate average fuel efficiency guidelines based on fuel weight. And then the EPA will measure car fuel efficiency, and those agencies together will come up with a guideline for where they want miles per gallon to be based on weight of vehicles. Then the second step is there's a public comment period. And in this period, it's a rigid procedure. That tiny URL takes you there. You guys can go fall down that rabbit hole. I had so much fun on Saturday looking things up. You can search and find out what kinds of rules and regulations were out there. I spent maybe a half an hour looking up. My favorite place in the world is Acadia National Park up there on Mount Desert Island. What's up, my friends? I hope to see you this summer. Please, please, all my friends up there at Mount Desert Island in the high school, keep my fingers crossed. If you want to go look and see what are they talking about there in that national park, they're talking about issues of writing rules and regulations that have to deal with air quality components because there's so much traffic that are on the loop and it causes smog and other issues that are concern to conservationists and to public property issues. So what you have the opportunity to do, and this is about representation for you, is that you can actually, when there is a regulation or a rule that has been proposed, you can comment on it, and anyone can do it. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be in a special interest group. You don't have to have specialized information. You can just say, this is something I don't agree with, and here's why. And it's an ability for you to kind of lend some perspective into this process where targeted industries, academia, and interest groups may miss that issue. So it's a really fun way for you to be able to keep track of how laws are moving from this nebulous kind of undefined set of rules to more specific, concrete rules that will be enforced. And that's what gets us to our enforcement part here. So after this, after the commenting period is over, the rule is published in the Federal Register and it now has the force of law. Federal agencies, they will even more refine these things into things called more refined rules and regulations into things called standard operating procedurals, which is about process, which is about how it is that you go ahead and carry these things out. And off the top of my head, one of the SOPs that was in the news in the past 4 years had to do with the change for immigrations and customs enforcement in terms of how it is that they identified people that they felt were not here in America legally. So these standard operating procedures had to deal with where they were going to find these individuals, how they were entering those premises, so on and so forth. So standing operating or SOPs are important, and it's another component of that thing we kind of lump together as red tape. In addition to that, some of our regulatory agencies, in addition to being quasi-legislative, where they're making rules because they have delegated authorities, are also what we call quasi-judicial, where they can actually act and behave as a justice or as a court, and they can go ahead and negotiate between two parties, right? Sometimes it's the federal government and the offending or the person accused, so on and so forth. The IRS has these powers, the EPA has these powers, Security and Exchange Commission has it, the Federal Communications Commission. Like these are all of our quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial agencies. And you'll notice that sometimes they're both. Public perception is really important. Bureaucratic agencies want to build and sustain political support because that ensures that they continue to have funding, that there continues to be jobs. They are self-interested in making sure that their agency survives. So how do we challenge these things? Litigation, obviously, number one, right? And we'll jump into this more tomorrow. Congressional oversight, hearings, appropriations, personal contact, media events, all of these things, even sunsetting or putting in expiration dates into policy that forces them to be re-legislated if we want to continue to have them. It's not necessarily oversight, but it's a really cool way to make sure that there's limitations. And then executive action, the critical thing here is remembering personnel is policy. I'm going to talk more about all of these things tomorrow. So let's get moving. So we see here that the process finds pressure from other components of this policy making cycle, that it's not just the other agencies or the other branches in a vacuum, that you also have an ability to influence them. Okay, so that brings us to today's FRQ, and I think I've saved myself enough time to work on getting an FRQ done in front of you guys. Remember, we're doing our content application, so we're looking at and I've told you, identify, define, describe, explain, identify, describe, explain, identify, describe, explain, A, B, and C, to increase the odds that you're getting the points. If you're still stuck on those terms, look at last Friday's, check out this list. This is our FRQ. We're looking at US v. Nixon. And I should say too, some of you have asked for the stuff that I train you on. I can hand these over because they are like, I can create them in a PowerPoint slide and like even upload or whatever, because I've created them for the purposes of this to train you. And I'm walking through them. They're pretty accurate in terms of what to expect, but I'm giving you stuff from College Board for you to practice as homework so that I can replicate to the best of my ability those questions. And other than putting them in the PowerPoint, I'm not releasing them because they're not mine. Okay. Oh, just kidding. So let's take a look at this fun thing here. Here is our lovely, where am I? Wrong one. Miss Hitch, you're wasting time. I'm back. I think this is it. I'm hoping. Nope, it is not. My camera's been disconnected. Let me see if I can like work my way through this. You just sit there and think about, what are you going to do when you're done with this? As I'm trying desperately to figure out where my camera went. Oh, from camera. All right. So ungraceful. Gosh, I'm wasting everybody's time right now. There we go. I found it. Okay, friends. So here is our FRQ for the day, and I'm going to transition to writing. So now you just get to watch the top of my head and my hand fly across the paper. All right, so let's read this. In support of his claim of executive privilege, already I know since we're talking about executive privilege that we're talking about the president, right? And I see that it's not just the president, it is also the president's counsel. So this is executive office of the president, if not actually White House office. All right. Need for protection of communication for those who advise and assist them in their duties whenever the nature of the privilege or confidentiality of presidential communications makes sense. We're talking about executive privilege in the exercise of Article 2 powers. The privilege is derived from supremacy of each branch within their own assigned area of constitutional duties. You know what that sounds like, my friends? I know you're thinking it. It sounds like separation of powers, doesn't it? Certain powers and privileges flow through the nature of enumerated powers. The protection of confidentiality and presidential communications has similar constitutional underpinnings. The presidential counsel supports the claim of absolute privilege. Wow, absolute. That means there's no exceptions to that. That's pretty pervasive. Rest in the doctrine area, separation of powers, argue the independence of the executive branch. I'm hearing some Fed 70 here, especially when he talks about secrecy. From a judicial subpoena. So we have a check here, right? In an ongoing criminal prosecution, thereby protects confidential presidential communications. So it sounds like as the separation of powers is more important than checks and balances, according to this, according to the lawyer for the president. However, neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain absolute unqualified presidential privilege and immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. So the courts are outlining this is what the lawyers have said, that separation of powers is more important than checks and balances. And Chief Justice Warren Burger is coming back and saying, it's not universal, like you don't get to have it all the time, right? So this is the court, and again, they are interpreting, so this is really important. He's saying checks and balances sometimes trump separation of powers. It's circumstantial. Our privilege depends solely on the broad, undifferentiated claim of public interest in the confidentiality of conversations and confrontation. Impediment of that an absolute unqualified privilege would get in the way of constitutional duty would plainly conflict with the courts under Article 3. Okay, I think we're all on the same page. We've read it. Let me see what time it is. So, describe a power that the Supreme Court could use. Did you think about it? It took me like 1 second. Let's repeat our prompt. The Supreme Court could use judicial review. To, and here I need to describe, determine that executive privilege is not universal. And they talked about criminal proceedings, didn't they? So I might want to say something about in the face of judicial proceedings. So I have an identify and a describe, right? They go on to say, explain, because, what do they say? Public interest requires the ability to investigate when laws are broken, period. That's our A. I have an exclaim. Yes, it's an exclaim. I have a describe and an explain. Moving on. B, in the context of this scenario, explain how the use of the Supreme Court's power, the described and explain, described in Part A, can be affected by its interaction with the president. So what can the president do, right? I'm not talking about the Supreme Court. I'm talking about the president. What can the president do to affect the Supreme Court, right? Okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things, but not really, right? You can look at appointment, but the appointment power here in this position, if we're talking about within a case, it's going to be hard to find any impact that a president might have in an appointment power. Number one, you could say something along the lines of they can appeal at this point. If it's Chief Justice Warren Burger, there's no appealing here, right? You could make an argument. I mean, I don't really know what argument you could make in terms of doing any other litigation, right? Story's done. So the best thing that could happen, and you know it, let's repeat it, could ignore the courts. All right, so let's write that down. The president can affect the powers of the Supreme Court's decision by ignoring the holding. That is our identify. Let's describe. Simply refusing to comply with the court's definition of executive privilege and not releasing subpoenaed information. We know the subpoena came from the prompt, right? We talked about that somewhere. Just can't find it right now. So that's my description, right? So now I'm going to turn the corner, affect this relationship. What's a natural thing that might happen? Because you can't investigate when you don't have information. The investigation and trial would fail to be assisted by turning over confidential material. Boom. Let's look at C. In the context of the scenario, explain how the interaction between the Supreme Court and the president can be affected by Congress. Well, gee, my friends, this one is a gimme, right? Could you imagine a situation where a president refused to ignore or refused to comply with something that the court said, particularly as related to an individual investigation? It would be pandemonium. And I hate to say it, but I think the I word is a great word to use here. Congress can affect the president's failure to comply with the court's subpoena by impeaching the president. That is my identify. Let's elaborate. Threatening to remove the president via impeachment for failure to honor checks and balances is a critical component of limited government. Ultimately, removing a president sets a precedent that executive privilege is limited. Okay. I think I did it in 15 minutes, right? I think I started at 3:35, so that's right on the dot. And that's me taking some time to talk to you as I'm going through this. So I want you to be able to see that like this is doable, right? And again, it's you don't have to have the most creative, out of the box solution to these things. Again, I'm going to come back to you and say that the lowest hanging fruit, the most obvious thing is generally the best way to progress back to this, the best way to progress through this, because it affords you the ability to kind of, you know, have a predictable answer. And I'm going to advance. Here we go. So that is the end of that. All right, here are questions. I'm going to wrap this up really quickly. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates the process of bureaucratic rulemaking? Is it A, Senate Committee, Veterans Affairs considers the credential of a person nominated to serve? So wait a minute, before we get any further, I see Congress, I see this is nomination, the answer is not A. B, the Department of Veteran Affairs rewrites its regulations regarding compensation and pensions. I see rewrites, I see regulation. It's pretty good. President signs executive order, nope. And then Supreme Court, as soon as we get into Supreme Court, we're not there, so it is B. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates delegated discretionary authority? A, Congress giving the EPA the power to establish national pollution standards. B, the chair of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce appointing the chair of the Environmental Subcommittee. C, the House of Representatives establishing jurisdiction for a committee. And D, the president nominating the Attorney General of Ohio. It's A, right? Very good. These are all the things we did today. We did it. We did everything that I set out for us. I'm so proud of us. We did it, even with some technological snafus. Here is your assignment for tonight. Remember, if a teacher gives you feedback, that's because they are doing me a favor. They're doing you and I a favor. So thank you so much, teachers, for helping us out. And again, tech stuff, you guys know that message. Here are my lovely resources for the day, should you want to dig deeper. And other than that, I hope to see you back here again tomorrow, right? We have a regular standing appointment at 3 o'clock. We will see you then. Have a great night. I will, we'll see you then. Yeah. Bye, friends. Bye.